This is VOA News. I'm Joe Ramsey. The United States announced a new $300 million arms package for Ukraine on Wednesday, including air defense systems and tens of millions of rounds of ammunition, but warned Kyiv that U.S. weaponry should not be used to attack within Russia.
We have communicated privately to the Ukrainians as recently as last week or so that we don't want to see U.S. supplied equipment used to strike inside Russia, that we don't support attacks inside Russia, and that we are not going to change our policy about not enabling or encouraging those attacks.
National Security Council spokesman John Kirby. The U.S. House of Representatives squared up to vote on Wednesday to suspend the U.S. debt limit, a critical step to avoid a destabilizing default, Reuters correspondent Chris Dignam reports.
Republicans control the House by a narrow majority, but the debt ceiling bill will need support from both parties to pass, as members on either side of the aisle object to significant parts of the legislation. The legislation would suspend the U.S. debt limit through January 1st, 2025, allowing Biden and lawmakers to set aside the politically risky issue until after the 2024 election. The Treasury Department has warned that it will not be able to cover all the government's obligations by June 5th if Congress doesn't act.
Reuters correspondent Chris Dignam. A spokesman for Sudan's military says it has suspended its participation in talks with a paramilitary force it has been battling for weeks. The development is a blow to the United States and Saudi Arabia, who have for weeks been mediating the conflict between the African nations' warring sides. Find more on our website, voanews.com. This is VOA News. Officials in northern Cameroon on Wednesday requested more troops after fresh Boko Haram attacks killed at least 12 people, including 6 soldiers on Tuesday. Moki Edwin Kendezka reports from Yandui.
Cameroon military and government officials in the Central African state's northern border with Nigeria say they held a crisis meeting on Wednesday, less than 24 hours after a fresh wave of deadly Boko Haram attacks were reported. Officials at the crisis meeting ordered by President Paul Biya on Wednesday in Marwa, the capital of Cameroon's far north region, requested that troops from Cameroon, Nigeria and Chad be deployed to stop militants from reconstituting groups and advancing. Moki Edwin Kinzaka for VOA News, Yaoundé, Cameroon.
Bipartisan talks aimed at resolving differences between Kenya's opposition and the government of President William Ruto have been suspended indefinitely, the co-chair leading the talks said on Wednesday. The talks were suspended after the government failed to meet the opposition demands, said the co-chair of the joint bipartisan talks. The opposition coalition, led by veteran leader Raila Odinga, has in the past few months been at a crossroads with Ruto's ruling alliance. Western leaders are ramping up efforts to defuse a crisis in Kosovo amid ongoing tension. AP correspondent Mimi Montgomery reports.
Ethnic Serbs are continuing to protest in northern Kosovo, where clashes with NATO peacekeepers recently left dozens injured. Over fears of renewed conflict in the troubled region, EU officials are now in talks with Serbia and Kosovo top officials, and NATO is sending 700 more troops. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is urging all parties to de-escalate tension, and his EU counterpart Josep Borrell calls the situation dangerous and unsustainable. Ethnic Serbs are in minority in Kosovo, but in majority in the country's north, with many rejecting the Albanian majority territory's claim of independence from Serbia. I'm Mimi Montgomery.
Negotiators charged with hammering out a global treaty to end plastic pollution were warned there was no time to lose on Wednesday. After progress was slowed by 2 days of procedural debates, campaigners blamed on large producer countries. Representatives of 175 nations have gathered in Paris for the second in 5 rounds of negotiations aimed at reaching a historic, legally binding agreement covering the entire plastics life cycle by next year. I'm Joe Ramsey, VOA.
This is VOA News. I'm Marissa Melton. Russia's mercenary boss Yevgeny Prigozhin is laying more criticism on Russia's defense ministry and its war machine. Reuters' Matthew Laratanda has more.
As fighting continues in eastern Ukraine, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of Russia's Wagner Group mercenary organization, says his fighters will finally leave the ruins of the city of Bakhmut on June 5th after handing control of it to Russian government troops. Pullout began May 25th and was originally slated for completion by June 1st. Prigozhin says the mercenaries will rest for about a month. He also continued his constant criticism of Russia's military brass, saying that his forces shouldn't have to operate alongside what he called clowns who turn people into meat.
That's Reuters' Matthew Laratanda reporting. In other news from Ukraine, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky thanked the United States for a new $300 million aid package that includes air defense systems and ammunition. The United Nations expressed concern the Black Sea grain deal continues to operate far below capacity as Russia continues to block usage of one of the three ports authorized under the deal to get Ukrainian grain to international markets. The U.S. has announced that a temporary suspension of tariffs on Ukrainian steel has been extended for a year, and the United Nations has expressed concerns about repeated attacks on healthcare facilities in Ukraine. Jordanians expressed happiness as they gathered on the streets of Amman to celebrate the wedding of Crown Prince Hussein to his Saudi bride Rajwa Al Saif on Thursday. Women in traditional dresses danced and clapped while men performed and banged on drums. The ceremony was attended by around 140 guests, including invited royals and head of state. From Washington, this is VOA News. New mothers in Democratic Republic of Congo can be effectively held hostage if they can't pay their medical debts. But one businesswoman is paying maternity bills and allowing them to return home. Like many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, Democratic Republic of Congo has no universal health coverage. Reuters' David Doyle has more.
While President Felix Tshisekedi's government is ratifying a law to make health services free for the vulnerable, the minimum $40 required to give birth in a health facility is out of reach for many. According to the World Bank, more than 60% of Congo's population lives on less than $2.15 a day. Cash-strapped hospitals say they're forced to keep patients until they've paid in full.
So I said to myself, why not help these women have their fundamental rights? The right of a woman not to be detained in a maternity hospital just because she's given birth.
Reuters' David Doyle reporting. The United States issued economic and travel sanctions Thursday on combatants violating ceasefire agreements in Sudan, imposing restrictions on visas and cutting off financial sources for both the Sudanese armed forces and the paramilitary rapid support forces. VOA's Jeff Custer has more.
The two sides signed a U.S.-Saudi brokered 7-day ceasefire May 20th, intended to allow for the delivery of humanitarian assistance. They agreed to a 5-day extension May 29th. Speaking in Oslo, Norway, Thursday, ahead of the formal announcement of the sanctions, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said there's evidence the ceasefire is being ignored.
We're seeing actions, again, by both sides in clear violation of the commitments they've made in terms of the ceasefire. That also is not the right direction to be heading, and it's certainly not what's in the interests of the people of Sudan.
In a statement, the U.S. Treasury Department said the economic sanctions are aimed at shutting down the revenue flow from 4 companies affiliated with both sides, generating revenue from and contributing directly to the conflict in Sudan. Jeff Custer, VOA News, Washington.
Zimbabwe's parliament has approved a controversial law that ostensibly promotes patriotism, but has been denounced by the opposition as a draconian attempt to stifle dissent ahead of national elections. The bill passed by the lower house criminalizes acts that damage what it called the sovereignty and national interest of the southern African country. In the most extreme cases, violators run the risk of up to 20 years in prison. The law was approved just hours after the government announced nationwide elections for August 23rd. And Iran carried out 142 executions in May, marking the highest number of people put to death in 1 month since 2015. This, according to the Oslo-based Iran Human Rights Group. Marissa Melton, VOA News. This is VOA News. I'm Marissa Melton. U.S. President Joe Biden said he will sign into law on Saturday the bill passed by Congress this week to raise the U.S. debt ceiling and curb spending after nail-biting negotiations. Both the U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives passed a bill that lifts the government's $31.4 trillion debt ceiling, averting what would have been a first-ever default as early as June 5th. In his first address from the White House's Oval Office to tout the passage of the bill, Biden highlighted compromise and consensus as the only way American democracy can function.
Passing this budget agreement was critical. The stakes could not have been higher. If we had failed to reach an agreement on the budget, there were extreme voices threatening to take America for the first time in our 247-year history into default on our national debt.
The United States says it doesn't plan on building more nuclear weapons to counter threats from Russia, China, and a growing number of adversaries who have or could soon have nuclear capabilities. Instead, according to White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, Washington plans to modernize its existing nuclear arsenal and continue to invest in cutting-edge technologies to keep adversaries in check. Sullivan said it will also keep open the possibility of talks to prevent a new nuclear arms race.
The fielding of weapons based on emerging technologies will create new, interconnected, and unpredictable escalation pathways. So we're working to establish new guardrails, especially in space and cyberspace. And of course, with the advent of artificial intelligence, this entire picture only becomes more complex and challenging.
And the nation's employers stepped up their hiring in May, adding a robust 339,000 jobs. VOA News. At least 207 people were killed and 900 injured when two passenger trains collided in Odisha on Friday in India. This according to Indian government officials in the eastern Indian state. It's India's deadliest rail accident in more than a decade. Reuters' Jillian Kitchener has more.
Crowds of people swarmed the wreckage of a train car in the eastern Indian state of Odisha, where officials say at least 200 people were killed and hundreds more injured after two passenger trains collided. Authorities say one of them, called the Howrah Superfast Express, derailed on Friday and became entangled with the other train, called the Coromandel Express. Images from the horrific scene showed rescuers climbing up the mangled wreck of one of the trains to find survivors. Scores of injured passengers were rushed to area hospitals for treatment. One official said there were over 800 people hurt.
That's Reuters' Jillian Kitchener reporting. The organizers of a new museum in New York say it allows their hope for a free China to survive. The exhibit is dedicated to China's 1989 suppression of pro-democracy demonstrations around Tiananmen Square. It comes after the closure of a similar museum in Hong Kong due to pressure from Beijing. Reuters' Matthew Laratonda has more.
Beijing has increased censorship of the Tiananmen events in recent years. Authorities raided the June 4th museum in Hong Kong and accused the group behind it of being foreign agents. Universities there took down Tiananmen monuments. Large-scale vigils for June 4th in Hong Kong have also been banned since 2020. And there's no sign one will be attempted this year. Activists outside of China continue to hold memorials. Wang Dan, the former student leader who also helped establish the New York Museum, says he's compelled to fight against the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, from erasing history.
Reuters' Matthew Laratonda reporting. Ukraine was high on the agenda in talks between Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Poland's Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki in Toronto. On Friday, Warsaw has positioned itself as one of Kyiv's staunchest allies. Poland has NATO's longest border with Ukraine and has been the main route in for weapons and out for refugees. Canada has also been a strong backer, providing military support to Ukrainian troops who are receiving training. In Poland, the Polish public overwhelmingly supports Ukrainians in their war with Russia, according to an Ipsos poll saying 82% of Poles think NATO and European Union countries should back Ukraine. Marissa Melton, VOA News. This is VOA News. I'm Marissa Melton. U.S. President Joe Biden signed into law on Saturday legislation that suspends the U.S. government's debt limit through January of 2025 and avoids a potentially disastrous default. Just days before the government runs out of money to pay its bills, the White House announced the signing in an emailed statement Saturday and said it was done in private. But Friday night, Biden made televised remarks from the Oval Office praising the negotiations between Republicans and Democrats.
Both sides operated in good faith. Both sides kept their word.
The bill allows the government to continue to borrow more money to over the current $31.4 trillion debt limit. After weeks of tough negotiations on the debt ceiling, before the lawmakers had worked on the process, and now they will work to reform the process. VOA's Patsy Widakwaswara tells us more.
Raising the debt ceiling is a routine process that has been done 78 times since 1960, but since 2011 has been a source of conflict when there's divided government. Many are now pushing to reform the process, including through proposed legislation that requires lawmakers to annually vote on policies to reduce the debt while automatically suspending the debt ceiling. The U.S. is now $31.4 trillion in debt and is racking up even more. The Congressional Budget Office projects a federal budget deficit of $1.5 trillion for 2023, which could nearly double to $2.7 trillion by 2033. Patsy Widakuswara, VOA News, Washington.
For more on this story, as well as pictures, videos, and more, follow the Voice of America on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. From Washington, this is VOA News. Environmental groups have given mixed reviews to the sometimes rocky talks on eradicating plastic pollution. The talks ended Saturday in Paris with an agreement to write the first draft of a groundbreaking global treaty. The deal reached after 5 days of negotiations, and the French capital sees a rough-cut zero draft produced before representatives of 175 countries next meet in Nairobi in November, where they have goals for a legally binding ban in force by 2025. The U.S. Pentagon chief in Asia for a security summit has told China the U.S. won't stand for the bullying of its forces or allies over the conflict over Taiwan. AP correspondent Jackie Quinn.
Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin in Singapore for a security summit sends a message to China.
We do not seek conflict or confrontation, but we will not flinch in the face of bullying or coercion.
He accuses Beijing of harassing U.S. and other aircraft flying over the Strait of Taiwan and the South China Sea.
An alarming number of risky intercepts of U.S. and allied aircraft flying lawfully in international airspace.
But that angered China's military deputy chief of joint staff, who accused Austin of making false accusations and warned they won't compromise over Taiwan and are ready to fight to safeguard territorial integrity. I'm Jackie Quinn.
Concerns have spiked around civilian safety in Ukraine after officials announced more than 25% of air raid shelters are locked or unusable. AP correspondent Karen Chamas.
The discovery comes just days after a woman in Kiev allegedly died waiting outside a shuttered shelter during a Russian missile barrage. In his daily address, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky expressed concern about the situation in Kiev. After everything has happened, Kiev residents repeatedly post information about the lack of access to shelters, not just about closed shelters, but about obstructed entrances to shelters, about the absence of shelters at all in some parts of the city. This level of negligence in the city cannot be excused. The Interior Ministry said that over 5,300 volunteers would continue to inspect shelters across Ukraine. I'm Karen Chamas.
A gun battle involving an Egyptian border guard in southern Israel at the border has left 3 soldiers and the Egyptian officer dead. That's according to both the Israeli and Egyptian militaries on Saturday. It was a rare instance of deadly violence along the frontier. From Washington, I'm Marissa Melton, VOA News.